Professor Mark Esposito, who will be our lead presenter this afternoon. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, the world navigates growing turbulence and complexity, and as public institutions, we have to ensure that we are future ready, we are able to adapt swiftly to change, we are able to anticipate disruptions in the environment. Without this readiness, we will be missing opportunities, there will be risks that will need to be taken, but anticipatory governance, which is a topic that is quite pertinent for us in public institutions, does offer us an approach on how we remain relevant, how we remain responsive in times of uncertainty and complexity. And so we'd like to take you on this journey today around how we explore the significance and the practical application of anticipatory governance in today's dynamic world. We're pleased to be joined this afternoon with Professor Mark Esposito. He is currently based with, well, amongst others, with the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government in the United Arab Emirates, which is a partner of the National School of Government. And as you may be aware, the National School of Government is a public sector training institution. We have been engaging on a number of partnerships to ensure that we bring depth and quality in the training to public servants. And we are particularly pleased with the relationship, with the partnership that we have with the Mohammed bin Rashid School, led by Dr. Arthur King, who has graciously supported us in this webinar in ensuring that we are able to work with Professor Mark in bringing this conversation to you today. We will also be joined by Professor T.K. Pue, who is based here in South Africa, and so he will be one of the respondents. We do encourage you to use the chat platform to type in your questions, your comments, and as we go through the morning, we'll be able to look at some of those and find ways to respond. Once again, I really thank you for joining the session. My name is Dino Punsami. I work here at the National School of Government, and I'm responsible for strategy and systems. Let me take this opportunity to introduce Professor Mark Esposito. Many of you would know him. He is recognized internationally as a leading global thought leader on matters related to 4IR, the Fourth Industrial Revolution. He's a global expert at the World Economic Forum and an advisor to many national governments. He's also a Harvard social scientist with appointments at the Center for International Development at Harvard Kennedy School. He's been working also as a faculty member at the Harvard University's Division of Continuing Education, where he teaches popular executive courses on artificial intelligence. He serves as a professor of economics, strategy, and foresight at the Holt International Business School, and he's also been appointed as a professor at Georgetown University, and of course, as I mentioned, a professor of public policy at the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government in the United Arab Emirates, as well as various other professorships that he holds around the world. Our respondent this morning, Professor Kagiso T.K. Pue, is familiar to many of us in South Africa, currently with the Wits School of Governance as an associate professor focusing on statecraft. He's a senior lecturer in key specialist areas, around local economic development, law and development, futures planning and thinking, failure analysis, and national interest. He's been within the academic environment for many years, having lectured and consulted with institutions like the Northwest University, as well as the University of KwaZulu-Natal and the Gordon Institute of Business Science. He's also been working with the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute, and prior to joining academia, he worked as a public policy research consultant within government with the Gauteng Provincial Legislature. He's also a former National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences Fellow and a 2019 Managing Global Governance Fellow. With that said, dear participants, I would like to take the opportunity to invite Professor Mark Esposito for this very enlightening discussion this morning. And we hope that you will find this quite enlightening yourself, as as well as being useful in the work that we have to do in building the public sector institutions. Mark, good morning and welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Dino. I hope you can hear me okay. It's
Yes.
a pleasure to be part of this kind of inaugural lecture or webinar that we're trying to organize between our two institutions. One of the critical function of a school of government is to inspire public servants to fundamentally think about some of the big challenges that we're currently facing, but equally equip them with the strategic outlook that is required. So with that in mind, the way we designed this time together is for me to run a few slides just to give you a bit of context on anticipatory governance and foresight. And then the idea, of course, is to engage in a dialogue and in a conversation that will be facilitated with my colleague, Professor TK, and equally with you as you are bringing your question to our attention. So I really look forward to the part of the time together where we kind of build our communities in the exchange. I'll start sharing my screen if that's okay with you. If you can just give me the okay that you see my deck.
Yes, we can.
All right. So a little bit of context on why anticipatory governance and what is the relationship between public institutions and anticipation. So you anticipated this, very well in the opening statement. We're living in incredibly volatile times. The amount of turbulence we're currently facing is something that is difficult to remember from previous times. And it is not only coming from one source of concerns. It's just that on a global level, multiple balances are being unsettled, and we find ourselves largely with big questions but very little answer these days. So one of the reasons why I started to work more on foresight, first of all, is the ability for foresight to be an exercise that is necessary for us to kind of get an understanding of the future differently from our historical dependency, largely anchor on data. Currently, what is happening in terms of understanding the methodology of work on foresight? And if we have to engage the public servant in the idea of future literacy, what do we do? Now, in fairness, the idea of anticipation is not new. One of my colleague, Real Miller, who was a former head of the anticipatory capacity at the UNESCO, has written extensively about the idea that anticipation is a critical part of performing public service. It doesn't always necessarily reflect in the way we are running institutions. And so what I'd like you to understand first is the urgency and why we need to think differently. And then later on, I'd like to engage in some of the more conceptual frameworks that we see applied in the context of anticipation and governance. Bit of a caveat that I need to bring forward. What is fundamentally changing a lot our sense of stability on a global level is that on a perspective of multilateralism, multiple countries are to some degree diverging rather than converging. So we see a degree of devolution that is becoming more visible. The devolution doesn't mean that we are no longer a global economy. The devolution simply means that we have multiple pockets of the global economies that are kind of building their own epicenters. And so as we see this degree of fragmentation, we have to kind of understand that a lot of what we know from the past might be limited in the ability for us to serve us moving forward. Now, what I like us to kind of get to is the idea that for us to start taking foresight seriously, we should think of the future as almost an institution. The idea of institutionalizing the future simply means that we want to start building capacity at the government level to think about the future in a way that is not necessarily an extension of the past by some form of a linear equation model, but we're thinking that very likely in the next few years, given this degree of transformation we're experiencing, but what we mentioned before, the devolution, the fragmentation, the rise of multipolarity and multilateralism across the world, we'd like to see more and more of the ability for governments to think about the future as something that is a serious activity and not necessarily a prediction. And I think creating the space for us to determine what is the difference between a prediction and a foresight is one of the conversations I'd like to have with you as well today. Now, to walk you through a little bit of why do we need foresight? I guess this is something my training is in economics, so I'm a trained economist. And every time that I see this, I wonder why many of my colleagues back in the days, but the same happens these days, they have become quite famous for being quite off the track on economic predictions. We continue to see economic predictions that are not necessarily happening. And we continue to see the reality fundamentally proving us to some degree wrong. Now, this is an example from the forecast of oil drilling in a period of time, 80 and 90. You notice there are a number of different institutional forecasts that you see them in white. And you notice that the reality, when you're looking at this with the passing of time, looks very different from basically what was forecasted. So why do we have a disconnect between what we consider to be a science that is coming from mathematical foundations and the application in real life seems to be very, very far? There's a number of reasons for that. One is related to the fact that, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my conversation, we tend to be overly dependent and overly reliant on the expectation that the data that we collect in the past will perform with comparable spectrum of reference into the future. And that might be true in the physical world, in which, for example, engineering, construction, retailing to some degree, might follow specific rules of penetration, territorial distribution. You could argue that any kind of activity that requires some form of planning because of the use of physical activities or physical materials might be anchored in some form of prediction model. And that's fine. The world is no longer, though, generating most of its GDP from manufacturing. We are over 70% of global GDP determined by services. The number will continue to rise as technology continues to be a significant driver of economic value creation. And so it's very likely that what used to work in the past with some degree of mistake in even the physical assets might continue to be less reliable moving forward, simply because we are changing the proxy of reference and how we are defining value altogether. So can we look behind the fog? Is there a way for us to fundamentally engage more systematically with this? We tend to extrapolate data from the past because we are very comfortable in doing this, and we have a lot of experiences in doing that. But we are kind of sometimes oblivious that there is no data on the future. And the same will happen for any government. Governments operate in the perspective of, depending on the government governance structure, either a shorter term, if they are government where you have in cycles of 4 to 5 years before another election, or if you have governments where you have so like a continuing governance by ruling families, for example, you might think that you have longer range of time. So regardless whether you're looking at a shorter or longer term in terms of the future, we are largely kind of illusion by the fact that we can understand the future by understanding the past. And I'd like to remind you there is no data on the future yet, right? So this is an exercise that has to be corrected in many ways. Anticipation and foresight does not disregard historical data. It simply wants to place historical data where it belongs, defining that the kind of question we are going to ask largely define the methodology of work in which we have. So if a government is trying to manage a construction of a physical infrastructure, let's say an airport, clearly data that can be extrapolated from the past might give us a reliable trajectory of understanding what could possibly happen moving forward, because we are dealing with kind of a more systematic, structured way of controlling the variables that are at play. But imagine the same question asked to the financial markets, or to the currency fluctuations, or to investor confidence, or what could be, for example, the impact of tariffs that have become these days a significant driver of uncertainty on a global level. So many of these questions that we tend to see becoming our primary concern today, they are not necessarily fitting into a spreadsheet that easily. And so we find ourselves on this ongoing limbo between our sense of confidence that is oriented towards the extrapolation of data, and our sense of reassurance that somehow the future will resemble. But many of the questions we're asking ourselves, they do not necessarily follow the very same structure itself. And so this is where the question is really to identify more and more the dimension of modularity in the positioning of the question that defines the question that are leading to a specific methodology. And this is why. So we historically look at the idea of a planning process. Imagine a government that is trying to fundamentally run a budget, a budgetary activity for 2025-26, or any kind of activity for attracting foreign direct investment. We tend to start with an initial hypothesis, because that we kind of have a strong proximity between some of the activity of the public sector and either economic policy or some form of financial diligence. So finance and economics to these days, they largely dominate some of the narrative at any government level. The hypothesis goes into a collection of data that tend to be much more specific. So we go into either the collection process, or we tend to hire consulting, or we are basically looking at the analysis of the data. But fundamentally, we're trying to validate some form of granular data that is going to be needed for us to support the hypothesis. We eventually get to a point where we narrow the hypothesis down, because now we have more data to make sure that the hypothesis is much more focal. And then we try to validate the hypothesis. So the idea is that, for example, a government will be very comfortable on how a policy that is going to support unemployment will become successful. And there will be tons of reports that will try to validate the assumption that eventually will become a policy option that might be voted in Congress and in Parliament. We build a model, which is basically how we're going to implement this. We make recommendation. That's where policy advisor like myself, that's where we stop. We stop at the level of the policy recommendation. And if you are a policymaker, you eventually try to debate this in Parliament and see whether this becomes law. Now, the challenge with all of this is that while the process is extremely systematic, you see this in the bigger part of the screen, it dismisses the outliers and the anomalies. In other words, it only works if we're looking at a much more static prediction, where we're not necessarily exposed to a lot of variability. But the moment in which, for example, you have unions in country where this happens, currency fluctuation, as was mentioned before, the markets becoming more skeptical, and therefore some of the investment eventually defaulting, some of the companies changing their fiscal regime for one country to the other because they might fear repercussion in their fiscal policy that the country is about to take. So you can name many of the traditional actors that are critical in a conversation around policy. So once you start having those variables in the picture, they all represent to some degree anomalies, because they have never been proposed or positioned in the same way in which they happen to appear, but they tend to be fundamentally limiting our focus. So our peripheral view becomes very narrow. And you see this from some of the summary underneath. We kind of find it difficult to differentiate a process from one fiscal year to the other. We tend to assume a lot of the incrementality, so we tend to feel comfortable with the fact that there is a sense of continuity that will be incremental. And when we do that, we've kind of apply a rule of thumb that any form of variation could be better understood by anybody but the public sector, the for-profit, the not-for-profit, with variation about 10 to 20%. This is kind of it's not really scientific, but it's a bit of a rule of thumb where we imagine that there is some degree of incremental adjustment that can be captured by a rate of 10 to 20%. So clearly, new ideas, they tend to be constrained because they have never occurred before. Now, just to give you a bit of a side comment, a lot of the new technology revolution that we are currently experiencing, they do not belong to the past. They don't come from the very same technology proposition that was coming as a spin-off from manufacturing. They are largely coming from an entirely different form of cognitive technology that is mimicking the brain rather than mimicking the mechanical part of labor. And clearly, as you see as a final part of my conversation, the contextual changes are completely ignored. So they kind of operate into a vacuum, but they don't take into account the fact that maybe from a local perspective, it might be very different. One of the things that I've learned, I was doing some work with a large South African conglomerate, and I was having a conversation about pricing. And one of the things I discovered is that the perception of what is price sensitive depends greatly on where you are in South Africa. And so imagine this the same at the policy level. A lot of the conversation based on policy efficacy depend greatly on the localization of the policy in the given region, municipality, territory, districts. And so we tend to be unable to capture context when we're operating in a typical planning process. Now, the idea of foresight and anticipation move us in a slightly different way. It's rather than thinking about a monological way of understanding reality, it's much more based on basically disruption. And so you see this basically on some of the visuals already, fundamentally what we want to say. So there's a typo here. This T is not supposed to be there. It's disruption without a T. So we start always from the same way. Then we start basic having anomaly. So we scan for anomaly. And this is where anticipation becomes particularly important. We start understanding what likely could be factors that are not statistically significant, but they might play a role because they are kind of visible in our scanning. We like to operate across domains of knowledge. That's because fundamentally disruption these days are not coming from a domain specific. They're much more interoperable across domains. We run multiple hypotheses, and that's where foresight becomes extremely useful because foresight, if I had to translate it into slightly different language, it would be like building options that are future plausible, so they could happen, but they don't necessarily come from a perspective of extrapolation data into linear modeling. Basically, foresight gives me the option about what could possibly happen. The anticipation try to understand it in a way that makes specific form of assumption based on the unfolding of the specific process. And then you're looking at the directional implication. You might find out that you might want to implement a specific policy where a tax is introduced into the country, but you might not consider that after a few rounds of implementation, a group of stakeholders might be impacted more than your original assessment. You might find out that time, because temporality has a significant role in redefining the value of our policy, might change the variance of the output against the desired outcome. And therefore, we might be able to do what basically is a form of calibration. And so the idea of building directional implication to start having a multi-stakeholder perspective. I'm going to try to give you a couple of examples on this and then try to move you into the next part of my conversation with you. So if you're thinking about, for example, a government or a local government that is introducing a tax on water because somehow the cost of water is increasing, there is the need to offset the increasing cost. No business can run if you are on a loss for a long period of time. Now, what happens to that tax? over a period of time when you're looking at the implementation of the tax across stakeholder. The ability for you to engage into that level of conversation, it is what we currently do not really do a lot in policy. So we tend to look at this because we validate the policy from a scientific perspective that is coming from the anchoring of the historical data. We don't necessarily look at directional implication. So there are ways these days to think about this more with support the digital dashboards where we can use technology to help us visualize this. The private sector has been quite successful in some instances to use this methodology that, as you can see, is operating from a multi-logic perspective rather than monologic to try to understand how market works. Government do not do this too much, although in fairness, after COVID, more capacity on foresight and anticipation have been introduced in governments around the world. So this is to say that we are at the early stage, or will likely will become a much more institutional integration of foresight and governance that is anticipatory at the government level. As you notice at the very end of this slide, towards the right-hand side, the purpose is eventually to develop portfolio recommendation that are going to run either pilots, experiments, any form of territorial adjustment that might be required. I remind you, every strategy is always local, regardless of the federal level. So likely the ability for government to test ideas in given territories, it is what, if you remember from the slide before, the kind of contextual intelligence that we do not have when we do in traditional strategic process, but we want to acquire in this way. When you start observing reality as a number of possible hypotheses that are leading to a number of possible logics, you fundamentally are changing the performance indicator from the precision or the exactness of the data to how specific the data is able to show you a range of possibilities ahead of you. You are not necessarily stopping yourself from what everybody knows. So there's a clear understanding that you're in the presence of novel structures. And that's where my colleague Miller talks about a lot. The fact that in anticipation, when you are experiencing novel structures, the idea of a novel structure is to contemplate the fact that any new element will likely change the evolution of the future. But if we are not capable of grasping them and understanding them, very likely we'll try to build a vision of the future that is distorted from what basically is the reality of that. That's because we haven't been able to understand something that is emerging in terms of novelty. And finally, this is not, as I mentioned before, scientific. The idea of foresight is to build representation of reality at the policy level, where multiple policy can possibly be discussed, moving away from what is instead policy that tend to be validated fundamentally from a financial and economic lens. And so these are some of the conversations that I think are critical to take into account on how governments can start introducing more of this like disruption resiliences as they start operating their policy models in times that are difficult to frame as normal, as we all know. So I'm going to move the conversation, ladies and gentlemen, a bit closer to where I'd like us to be in terms of the where I like at least the conversation to end from my side before we can open for the Q&A. So from here, we go to basically, let me skip one slide, a lot of like traditional methods of contextual uncertainty. I'm going to run them right this. So every time that we are moving our question to this side of the story or this side of the story, so when we start having a much wider range of uncertainty, then necessarily the methodology of work has to become less dependent on quantitative or probability models and moving closer to either systems, implication, future planning, scenario planning, foresight, gaming, simulation, you name it. So as you notice in this quadrant, there's a clear cut between the upper part and the lower part. The upper part tends to say that in time of control variables, We can use a lot of quantitative because it still makes sense as we don't have large variation in the evolution of time. When we're dealing fundamentally with more open questions that tend to be less dependent on the reliability of the past, we need to start changing the methodology. So one of the things that I hope you can take from the conversation today is that it is the question that you are asking yourself that largely defines the methodology of work. Governments these days, they have both questions typology. They have short-term questions that tend to be easily understood by data. They have long-term questions. They are not easily understood by data simply because of what we mentioned before. Data is insufficient to model what likely will be a future trajectory. So the idea will be to move us into a field that is much more related to anticipation. So that's to give you a bit of context on where I would like us to be in terms of the thought process. So once we are clear on this, if you think about fundamentally what we're going to do, we're taking messy problems, which is kind of trends and events. So we kind of take what seems to be a reality that we don't understand into what is a much more structured planning process. And this is really one of the major value addition of anticipation and foresight is that it does give us a sense of structure but not following a scientific approach. It's much more, as I mentioned before, a representative approach that is leading to the formulation of multiple logics that are going to generate multiple hypotheses that will drive multiple degree of calibration that tend to be much more sensitive to anomalies and outliers that are building on one side the anticipation of trends that we can anticipate because we understand them in terms of their magnitude, but at the same time, at the rise of a portfolio of option that is coming from the idea of foresight. So it changes structurally the language of policy in a way that we haven't really seen before. So I'm going to try to use the last stretch of my time together with you. I plan on maybe using another maybe 10 minutes, if that's okay, to get you up to the core, and then we'll have enough time for the conversation with my colleague, Professor TK, and also with Dino and with the participant who are part of the webinar right now. So let me kind of show you a question. So what is next? Once we understand the urgency that is coming from having a clear cut from the legacy predictive models that are largely determined by a collection of data that tend to be much more static and explicit, to the fact that we're dealing with significant number of wiki problems. So what is moving forward? So this is where in policy making, we have to start thinking about a number of different kind of core ideas. So first of all is the idea of identifying the trade-offs. Futures are, and I use the word future with the S on purpose, they need to be built on trade-off, not in the concept of zero-sum game, but trade-off in the sense that we're clear that we are not going necessarily to see a linear relationship between output and an outcome. Sometimes it might be non-linear. So how do you try to offset it so that it doesn't look like that on paper the policy might be beneficial, but in practice, the policy is going to be backfiring moving forward. Rethinking the collaboration of the data collection from a perspective of who is important in the kind of formulation of the policy. We tend to be very niche and very elitist. Somehow, a lot of government capacity tends to be on career politicians or career policymakers who are doing that for a large part of their time. The more we're opening up to kind of profile that are expanding our diversity, the better the process is becoming collaborative in many ways. The idea of public consultation is something that I have seen a lot when I've been working for the European Commission. It is a great way for us to think about government policy, as when a government openly says, I don't necessarily know the answer to a question, but I'd like to collect basically answer coming from the public. So public consultation are very powerful for us to determine basically the sentiment the public really have. And that is really moving more into the normative dialogue. So how do we start understanding that ongoing calibration about the offsetting of the trade-off is necessary? So basically creating a cross-judicial standard, they're going to be critical, especially when you're dealing with technologies that are going to be difficult for us to understand with the lens of the law. The idea that we are going to see more and more tension between regulating industry and technology-driven firms. And so understanding that a policy might work very well for a sector, but might become extremely damaged for another one. And so rethinking policy much more bespoke to the sector is a critical part of understanding that we're dealing with asymmetrical distribution of value creation and value assimilation across the industries. No longer we tend to think that we have convergence across the industries. The banking system understands this very well. They have introduced not too long ago the concept that we're dealing with a cave-shaped kind of structure of economy in which some industries are going to constantly thrive because they have largely digitized, and whoever owns the capital of the industry will continue to extract more value in time of artificial intelligence. Some industry they cannot easily digitize because they're still heavily dependent on territorial capacity, and therefore they don't have the same ability to assimilate policy that is extremely impacting, for example, from a fiscal perspective. And the last part of the conversation is understanding that yes, we are devolving much more. So devolution is definitely a driver. We're becoming fragmented and we are multilateral, but we are not necessarily insular or becoming isolated. We tend to have a smaller group of countries we tend to trade with, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not operating a cross-border approach. And so, how do you start thinking of a policy in which the private sector might easily operate across borders? So not necessarily in terms of the national interest, but also across different kinds of jurisdiction. This is not easy to navigate, but it's a question that is clearly important in any form of anticipation. So if I move you to basically what is the idea of agility and proactive governance? So you probably now will be able to recognize a lot of the language I use simply by having a summary of its own. So let's look at the different kind of boxes that we have. I'm going to try to be brief on this. Is the first of all the ability that we're looking at the adaptations, and we are introducing a degree of flexibility that came from the conversation I was having on the multiple logics. The idea that it is agile because it is actually iterative, right? It doesn't necessarily stay static with a line of execution that tends to be on ears. It tends to be constantly fine-tuned. And that's the fundamental difference from before. A policy that is willing to change simply because the policy in the implementation learns that the reality in which the policy was trying to regulate is different from what it was originally ideated or anticipated. So that's where the idea of agility is really coming from. Policy making becoming much more outcome driven rather than output driven. The idea that we tend to be very output driven tends to limit us to mathematical functions, input and output. But as I mentioned a couple of times during my talk today, sometimes there is an input, which is the policy. There is the output, which is the policy becoming implemented into the country. But the impact of the policy, which is the outcome, is not necessarily what we were expecting. We have ample evidence in many countries, for example, in the United States, with quantitative easing, that was designed to facilitate the access of loans and grants for small, medium enterprises when the interest rate were very low. But somehow this didn't really happen. And so there was a disconnect between the output, basically the Federal Reserve decreasing interest rates and making it easier for banks to borrow, and the lending to people, right? So if we change that, the goal is not the output driven, but outcome, it fundamentally changes the objective of measurement. We mentioned before collaboration across multiple stakeholders because we want to build a degree of diversity. We actually haven't mentioned it too much, but it's important to consider that a lot of the behavior that we're going to see in the next few years will probably not be following a specific kind of template. We're dealing with a multi-generation at work. we dealing with generations of work that are integrated in technology like robotic and artificial intelligence. We're dealing with generations that are fundamentally different because they had a very different inception point. Take an example of post-baby boomers that are finishing their careers and Gen Z that are now in their 20s and entering the labor market. Extremely different way of actually assessing reality. And so how do we start understanding that behavior will not be normative, but very likely will be impacted and vested by a lot of discontinuity as it doesn't converge. When we looking at the work of the forum, fundamentally, a lot of the governments tends to be industry driven. So there will be a significant amount of learning from the public sector can do on how the private sector is learning how to regulate. And simply because the private sector has a much more direct line of confrontation with the market that might be much more, to some degree, unforgiving. And so how do we build that degree of collaboration to understand what the private sector has been able to understand? A quick example on that is that in pharmaceuticals, the policy that the government are stipulating tend to be less sophisticated than the compliant policy that are stipulated by the private sector. And so there's a lot of cross-learning that has to fundamentally operate. We mentioned scenario, I call it also foresight, the ability for us to engage into multiple options rather than being boxed into only one. And the ability of agility to impact governance so that we are rethinking also the resources, the stakeholder time, the investment. It's a much wider engagement in the thought process. It's a mindset shift that is required for us to navigate this kind of world that we're dealing with. And ladies and gentlemen, this is even without the technological revolution, right? Simply that we are a much more sophisticated and integrated economy than before. If you're adding the technological revolution that is impacting investment, how countries are currently performing, the energy consumption, the energy race, a conversation we're going to have on regulation of data sovereignty. So we're dealing with conversation that the legal system has never seen before. So one of the things that I have seen at Harvard, where I'm also working, is that at the Harvard Law School, there are what they call cyber clinic that are trying to integrate technology and law. And they are clinics because like from the lab, the idea is to try to experiment what could possibly be policy approaches to what is an ever-evolving environmental change. So I'll try to bring my presentation over to a closure to basically try to give us a space for conversation. So the way I like to finish my time with you is in terms of my lecture. So look, technology is going to take us to an entirely different level of complexity moving forward. So we'll have to rethinking basically, as I mentioned before, the trade-off, the collaboration, the representation of stakeholder, the adaptation of policy, the regulatory landscape that is going to be non-linear and multi-jurisdictional, and the fact that governance will have to be largely pivotal because we are looking at the pace of the development of this technology infrastructure that tend to be larger than our ability to even assimilate. So once we start feeling more comfortable with the fact that the global structure or the global institutional framework or reference is moving away from the 20th century design that was largely anchored on industrial policy, then anticipation and foresight, they become two critical conversations to have at the government level. And some government have been pioneering this already for a few years. Other governments are quite new to this because they feel that they cannot really grasp the lack of scientific validation that this approach really has. And it is not to think the science is bad, but science has to be supportive of a specific set of conversations that are critical where the evidence base is able to model the future. And there are other circumstances where the data is simply insufficient to model the future. And we have to actually really tackle a different methodology. So this is to give you a bit of context moving forward on where we see governance becoming a critical part of the conversation in the years to come. So I will definitely share my slides with the team at the school in South Africa if you wish to look at the material with more time and attention to the details. For the time being, I'm going to stop this now. I have been speaking for uh, roughly 40 minutes or so. Um, and I would love to have the conversation with you as we move into what is the more dynamic part of the webinar when we open this up to the dialogue. So Dino, over to you in case this is where we can get to the next step of the conversation.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. Very, very insightful. I think you've raised a number of issues for us, particularly those in the South African public sector. Interestingly, the conversation comes at a time when we will now get into strategic planning for the next financial year. And there are many things that we have to reflect on as public servants. I think importantly for me as well as the points that you've raised around, I think many of us are caught in this, is the issue of extrapolating data from the past to make decisions of the future. And that is what you are saying, we need to focus on that. So I think it's been quite important, and how we start inculcating the issues around proactive governance, agile governance. But I think we're also caught in as bureaucrats in this whole sort of cycle around compliance, audit compliance, and this and what is allowed within the parameters of planning. So we've got to kind of keep one eye on the future of planning and risk taking, and on the other side you've got the issues around compliance. Have you complied with the way that you've planned, with the performance and so forth? Maybe some of your thoughts around that, and then I'm going to invite my colleague Bongani. Mr. Bongani Maimele is the head of international relations at the National School of Government. He'll make some inputs, and I think we'll open that. We already have some questions on the chat, so we'll deal with that as well. And we encourage our attendees, please post more questions, bring it closer towards what you are experiencing in your own public institutions, and how we'll be able to change quite a fundamental shift that we all have to be making when it comes to planning and of course the use of technology. Okay, back to you, Mark.
Thank you for this. I think it's a critical part of the conversation that should follow up right from where we are at the end of the lecture slide. So one of the things that I guess compliance, no matter whether it's a public or private, does, beside the alignment with the legal regulatory framework, the real purpose of complying is the mitigation of risks. We tend to comply because we are avoiding some form of risk. So either is a risk of information that is leaking, either is a risk of financial resources that are not controlled. In some country will be a risk to make sure there is transparency across the process. But risk is the undercurrent, is really what defines the reason why we have compliance. And we should welcome it. We have made a lot of effort around the world to make sure that we have more transparency in public as well in private. I think where we have to start understanding the challenge that the cost of inaction, of not changing our approach from kind of a past-friendly orientation versus what is like an integration of the past with a trajectory that tend to be anticipatory or optional in terms of foresight. The cost of inaction will be higher than just complying as usual. And I think this is where the engagement should be on reassessing how you are currently going to evaluate your risk, no matter whether you are the Department of Finance in a city, whether you are a Ministry of Trade in a government, whether you are the statistic office of the mayor of a given municipality. So no matter what is your scale or your size, how would you consider risk today? And the risk is way more, I think, fluid and formulated differently from before. And so in light of a different approach to risk management, anticipation is a great way to distribute the risk. If you think about basically what the financial industry does, everybody understand if I say this sentence to any of you, that a good way to invest resources is to distribute them across. The idea that not you don't want to place all the eggs in one basket, right? We grew up with this idea. What is it? You're trying to take the risk that the basket could basically get spoiled or stolen or broken across multiple baskets, right? So you want to distribute the risk at least horizontally. It's the very same principle. I'm always trying to ask the question to the public servant, how do you mitigate the risk that is coming from an historical understanding of the risk itself, considering that we're not dealing with the same risk anymore? And so once that question is basically formulated, and a group of people in a stakeholder capacities is engaging with the question, some of this answer needs to be formulated as options. So this is where I think, to your question, the mindset shift that you rightly say is so big and it doesn't necessarily happen overnight. I find that the trigger sometimes to make it faster is a serious engagement on the assessment of risk and what will be the risk of not doing anything. And I think this is clear, for example, environmental. Today, we understand that not doing anything about the environment is more expensive than doing something about it. And this is becoming a widely distributed narrative, at least in some parts of the world, the majority of the world. What the same can apply to a number of different factors, and technology definitely being probably one of the most visible threats that we currently have, not because it's a threat by itself, but because it's definitely a big change in how we define value, not only at the micro level, but equally at the macro level, at the government level. So that's reflection on your kind of initial dialogue with me on this, Dino.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I mean, I think it's an important point, and again, I think the issues of how we manage risk is important. I mean, for me, again, fundamental shift, not from just looking at risks in relation to what are in plans already, but what are risks if we don't make the shift? And I think that's a
That's
very
right.
different type of conversation on how we manage risks in the public sector.
That's right. If I
Um,
can give you one comment, on a conversation I was having yesterday with actually a national agency of a different country, right? So they basically run waste management for a country, and they were talking to me about circular economy, resorting to rethinking innovation and technology for managing waste differently. And I asked exactly the same question to them. I said, if you don't do anything, if you do business as usual, what's the risk? And the moment that you ask this question, you realize that the risk of not doing anything is way higher than what we can afford. I think the moment that you're realizing that the urgency is not in keeping things as they used to be, but in moving forward, then you're moving the resistance to change, because suddenly we realize that we're dealing with a risk that is way more prominent in this formulation that it was in our knowledge of what it used to be basically past practices. I think these are sometimes triggers that help the conversation to move from maybe resistance to change to, well, inevitability of change as we move forward.
Absolutely. Let me invite my colleague Bongani. He'll make a few inputs and there's some questions as well, so that we engage with yourselves. Again, we do also encourage participants. Please post your questions. We do have a couple, and Mark, you'll see how to deal with that as we get through. Thank you, Bongani.
Sure.
Welcome.
Colleagues that have attended the webinar today, and thank you very much to Prof. Mark for this very insightful webinar on anticipatory governance. I've been listening attentively to this, Prof. Mark. From what I'm gathering here, or trying to make sense of this anticipatory governance, is that it is, in my view, it was largely conceived as a private sector issue in the beginning, but it is increasingly becoming very important even in public sector organizations. Public sector organizations, which by their very nature are inherently conceived as bureaucratic organizations, and the stifles that bureaucracy can have on certain operations in the public sector, including innovation as well as anticipatory governance. what are the reforms that you think public institutions should have in order to enable anticipatory governance in the public sector? Because it is very important. The public sector is dealing with a myriad of challenges that in the past were not in their domain, and also they are competing with the private sector. So what are the urgent issues in your view? One, the first question is that what are the reforms that you think public institutions should have in order to build anticipatory governance capabilities? And in this current era of global turbulence, uncertainty, unpredictability,
Yeah,
um, in what areas? Let me just check this question here that I have. What are the urgent issues for anticipatory governance in the public sector? And what could be the role of enabling technologies such as big data, artificial
hmm
intelligence in order to build this anticipatory governance?
yeah,
And if you could give public sector leaders just three practical actions to start building anticipatory capacity tomorrow, what would they
that's
be?
right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bongani. Good to see you again, connected on this call. Look, I think this is a great question, and I can tell you where, considering the work that I do with the governments in the UAE, and kind of what we have experienced. Again, I'm not originally from the UAE, as you know, but as kind of an adoptive member of the UAE society, what I have witnessed. So the first thing that really happened is that you don't want to give away systems of control, right? Somehow governments, they need to take bureaucracy. If you think about how it originally started, was to make sure that a process would not empower any single individual with too much power, right? So there's multiple steps that needs to be taken into account. One of the things that I notice happening more and more is that if you're able to shift the process of bureaucracy into some form of technology infrastructure, so you can say, to simplify, this an app, you tend to free a lot of the resources that governments and time are unable to really deal with. I'm going to try to give an example on the driving license in Dubai. So if you can remember, in most country, everybody of us a bit older than maybe in their 20s, having a driver license after the driving test was passed was a process, right? You have to apply for it. There's a document that has to arrive. They take a picture. There was a degree of bureaucracy that is required to vet and verify that the person is now eligible to drive a car, because they're driving a car is an important act in society. Now, in Dubai today, by having shifted this entirely to a digital service, which is integrated, you literally go through probably 30 minutes with only one meeting with a person. The rest is basically through portal technology and a 3D printer who prints your driver license. And that is a process that has improved the service without necessarily removing the control. So the first action that I like to suggest to everybody is that do not think that improving the efficiency through technology is at the expense of control. It just simply means that you're changing the agency from what used to be people doing the job to a number of different tasks that are now delegated to technology. So that would be the first part, which is the overarching one. The second one is there are tasks that can be automated, like, for example, going to an airport and going through a security check with our facial once we scan our passport, and tasks that should not be automated. For example, having a conversation with a doctor for a concern that you have, or a police report for something that happened. So there's a clear space in which the taxonomy of task, based on what is critical and what is non-critical, can really open up a lot of space. Many organizations in the private sector have understood it because the private sector clearly has a flair for efficiency. Today, governments are equally understanding that if you're improving the access to citizen services through technology, you are at the same time delegating to what can be delegated a task that used to be done by people to basically an agent, which is a chatbot, and you're preserving more critical conversation where they have to be preserved. So it's really rethinking fundamentally the taxonomy of tasks by the degree of criticality that you have. That would be my second advice for basically the public servant. The third one is we come from like an historical layer after layer process in public policy. In other words, if you think about how we basically grow the public policy capacity is stratified. One thing that really helps to do that is when you're digitizing your data to the point that you're understanding dimension and correlation you never understood before. I'm going to try to run another examples. I was doing a conversation with a minister in the UAE, and so the chief of staff asked me the question, how can we make sure that this task is not redundant with another ministry or another department in the government? And that question shows you what many governments struggle with: redundancy and duplication of tasks across ministries. The reason why that happens is because sometimes the left hand doesn't talk to the right hand. Legacy system, different kind of governance model, different physical buildings, right? Different IT infrastructure. So an effort that definitely helps a lot is to try to study an assessment of redundancy to make sure that you're not allocating resources where they shouldn't be. But for you to do that, you have to start becoming interoperable across different departments. So there's a transformation that needs to happen that is to some degree cultural, to some degree on the assessment of the task, and to some degree on the disintermediation of the task to technology in favor of basically efficiency. There are, Bogani, three steps that are critical for the public sector, not necessarily just to compete, because I think it's naturally that there is competition, but simply to get on board where they have to go on board, especially in times where the role of governments globally is more important than before for a number of reasons, because you can't trust the markets to be a moral judge on basically what is better for society. You can't trust the financial market to be a fair redistribution of resources. So there's a clear space for government not to deregulate itself, but to actually regulate itself in the right way. But for this to happen, the process has to be efficient. And for that sense of efficiency, not only in terms of economics, but in terms of the functioning, these are three ideas that I have seen directly applied across the region and where I operate, but also outside, and where it has been a game changer. Over to you again, Mogani.
Prof. Mark, I think it's over back to Dino, and thank you very much for
Dino, thanks so
your
much.
response. And
Thank you very
Yes.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Mark and Bongani. Mark, some of the questions that are coming through on the chat.
Sure.
The first one, really to thank you for very interesting lesson and the innovative concepts. Do you think the future will be shaped by asymmetrical distributions of value that vary from country to country, marking the end of policies based on aggregated interests at the continental level? And if so, how can we still translate continental or global policies into meaningful local actions? That's from Auri. Maybe
Sure,
you
it's a
want to
beautiful
take that,
question.
Mark?
Yeah. It's a complex one. Auri, thank you for asking this question. And I found it beautiful because it's equally a very complex question to answer just like that. But I'll try my best to give you a sense of direction on that. So I start by where I think you have hit the nail on the head, as they say. Asymmetrical distribution of value is inevitable when you're having growth at the country level that is not determined by industrial capacity alone. So basically factory that are becoming advanced and then services, but where you're having entirely different digital capacity that are built in infrastructure based on technology that are accelerating country at the way that we have never seen before. And so I think clearly the gap will become, in terms of the digital gaps, much more pronounced, at least for the foreseeable future, simply because not everybody has either the resources or the innovation capabilities, or even the right kind of attractiveness to bring investment. One thing is to say, I'm going to move my capitals from one country to the other because it's cheaper. But that was the argument of manufacturing, in which you could think that country that used to be basically on factor driven, so agriculture based, they could move up, right, and become advanced in farming first, and then in manufacturing, then in services, and then eventually aspire to become innovation. You see this in countries like Singapore, that started poor and became a powerhouse. We see this in countries like South Korea that was poor in 1997 when the IMF defaulted this. And within basically a decade, the country was able to rethink itself, right, by becoming an industrial conglomerate through the family businesses. We saw this in countries like Finland that was largely dependent on the Soviet Union until the 90s. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, the country in a relatively short amount of time was able to dominate, right? In the year 2000, was one of the top 15 competitive economies in the world. So I think the understanding that we have in on all of this is that what was the rules of engagement of the past does not count anymore for competitiveness. So that means that your point, Ori, on asymmetrical distribution is absolutely clear in the evidence on how countries are growing, and clearly country that also have demographical conversation, country that have aging population, all these factors in. The second part of the conversation is on kind of where is this tension going to be shifted in terms of the collaboration. I mentioned something before during my lecture that I think is important. We're going to see the reinstatement of clubs. The idea of a club was the fact that you're not doing business with everybody, but you're doing business with whoever is closer in terms of the proximity of value that you're willing to share. And so if you think about what's currently happening in terms of the trade capacities around the world, we tend to trade either more regionally because it simplify the geographical distances. We trade with country that we can have an agreement with. And if we can trade, definitely it's become punitive, right? Like we're seeing a lot with the trade tariffs. And so clearly this will create, as I mentioned at the very beginning, different pockets of kind of a convergence, rather than thinking that we'll have one major convergence based on doing business with everybody. It will be convergence that will be much more localized, which is kind of the third part of the conversation. So it is a tension that we'll need to actually operate. And how can you think about contextually local policy that are impacting where people really live? But your relevance can only be local. It has to be global. And so it can go back into whether the policy are going to create ecosystem of reference that are eventually going to innovate, where you're having startup, they're going to be financed globally by global capitals. They're going to raise and scale regardless of how small or how big the country is. So rethinking fundamentally the growth direction based on this localization is likely what we'll see happening more and more, which give us chances for a country that maybe did not have chance before because they were too small to participate. But it also means that if you're on the wrong side of the asymmetrical distribution, the distance to cover is much wider. So that's why I think it's not an easy period of time for us to navigate, because we don't really have a clear vision of what we should achieve, as the very same perspective about the future has multiple answers depending on who you are. And this is creating ideological echo chambers, which is difficult to navigate. So thanks for your question, Ori. I know that it's not fully exhaustively answered, but I hope we provide you some context.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mark. We do have another question from Johnny. I mean, of course, the issue around forecasting for the future is informed by some of the established fundamentals. But how do we forecast unpredictable leadership? When it comes to, for example, leadership that do not follow well-established fundamentals, unorthodox approach towards diplomacy, economy, and so forth.
Yeah.
So how do we?
Yeah. So, look, I think it's, Johnny, thank you for the question. And I understand where that question is coming from. I don't think we can necessarily anticipate it in a way that we can kind of predict it. But what we can predict is that and back to the question I was answering to Ori, right? The moment that you're having a wider sense of asymmetrical distribution, you're naturally polarizing, right? You're creating more distances between social groups, social classes, economic capacity, redistribution of assets and funds. And so when you're having more polarity, or actually more polarization, you tend to reduce the convergence into the center. So you tend to see that the center, which is where traditional middle class tends to orbit, is weaker. When you are radicalizing, we know this by sociology, right? There's a gentleman called Overton that has studied it's actually something called the Overton window, where you can say that when you're having extremely radical political ideas, no matter whether they are right or left, you tend to see the rise of individuals that are kind of representing the degree of polarization. So somehow you don't know who will eventually come up as the outlier that could be disruptive, but you do understand that if we having more polarization and we having more access to radicalization, you're going to have a larger number of statistical incidents where you have people that are going to represent the degree of ideological polarized view. So this is almost like it's contingent to the fact that we have polarized. So to your point, Johnny, we had to create the space for the center to re-engage. And that are a lot of issues that no matter whether you are right or left, right, you see as common. And so how do we build the space again? I think this is a critical conversation between communities that has to engage, social media that has not really helped to converge. It has actually helped to become fractional and echo chamber driven. How do we start actually generating conversation that are using social media for convergence rather than for insularity and divergence? Rethinking social metrics on how we basically are evaluating growth or value or success in many ways. So I think there's a societal dimension that needs to be taken into account. But the end game should be in reconstituting the center as a space for ideas to float. Otherwise, the more distant we are, the more we're going to see that the representation of identity happens by denying the other. And this is what we have seen in another. Look, the polarization in the United States is very strong. The polarization in some European countries is very strong as well. But you could argue polarization in Asia is strong. So it's no longer a problem, for example, of the West, which could be perceived as a fatigue civilization these days. It's really happening because we have become less capable of like a semantic dialogue based on exchange of common values. We have instead created a culture in which defining what I am not is more important than defining commonalities. And I think this is where policy has a critical role in how do we eventually regulate social media. I would say social media is where I see the biggest possible transformational impact out of the many different options that we have. On top of education, of course, how family talk to each other. But I think social media has become a fourth power, but it has also become a power of deviation from reality. So thanks for your question, Johnny. Very, very, very meaningful.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mark. Just one more that we have from one of the participants, Onesimo. How do we address inadequate involvement of stakeholders in governance? This is one of the challenges faced by Agile institutions, and I think it relates very much to the discussions you are raising about particularly public consultation, but how the trade-offs with stakeholders really, right? And so for me, it was also important to understand as we build these Agile institutions, the types of partnerships that we need to be establishing, particularly, within government itself, but with academia, civil society, and so forth. It's got to require something, more fundamental if we're going to move towards this sort of, level of agility in public institutions.
That's right. So thanks Onesimo, for your question. Look, there are two dimensions to your question. One is the inadequacy part. I think we have to be able to understand who contributes and who doesn't contribute. And that's clearly a performance problem, right? Where we don't find that contributing to a public discourse is an entitlement. It is a service in many ways. And so defining what are the boundary of a service to the point that you recognize who have vested interest in the conversation by contributing and who has maybe less vested interest. So it's a clear selection issue, right? In identifying who contributes the most. I think if you go a little bit deeper in that, honestly, the question of representation of stakeholders really is a challenge we have in governments. A lot of the voices that tend to be usually represented, they tend to reinforce the very same mental models, right? And people from affluent parts of the society, or people are coming from the industrial conglomerates, or people coming from the financial and today the technology environment, they tend to be louder, right? They contribute more. But there's a significant number of people that are simply never represented in their voices. And I think the wider range of representation we have in, the more it's not necessarily just for representation, which is functional, but it's for us to formulate the question better. Remember what I said before. So I think this is why a wider range of diversity in who is going to contribute in the conversation. There was something I was showing before in the slides called directional implications. You can only do directional implication if you have a wider sense of the system you're dealing with. And so you can only do this if the system is properly represented, not necessarily exhaustively or in an absolute way, but enough for you to determine that within a representation, you're capturing the essence of a society. So this is where I find this is so important that we are rethinking governance by who contributes, the diversity we're going to have, the fact that you want to have a multi-age group, right? The people that represent the different views at the same time. And back to my first answer to you, should never feel an entitlement, right? And that is going to create an even wider sense of vested interest that is ideological inside of a given public service, which goes back to what I was mentioned before, to the question that Johnny was asking, right? That what eventually isolate or insulate us from representation of a society that many times has been left out. And so I think this is, again, I know it's theoretical and sometimes is about more of an intellectual conversation, but the moment that you say this as a theoretical conversation, you can try to determine what could be likely the pilot to test the assumption into the real world and define what could really work. That's, I think, one of the challenges we have in general about governance in the 21st century is that it's not coming from the rigor of the method, is really on the fine tuning and the tweaking on the territorial dynamics that are constantly changing. So thank you for your question. I appreciate that.
Thank you for that, Mark. I think the last one is more directed towards myself, and of course, I think here as the South African public service, I mean, really around what you are raising, the left not knowing what the right is doing, and I think is probably a common problem we find, particularly in public institutions, the so-called silo approach in the way we're doing things. So Brian's question really is for us in the South African context, in our public institutions. How do we establish forums or structures that we can share and engage ideas on digital improvements? So we have good success stories, our home affairs, our revenue services, and so forth. But there's no place that we can actually share. So we've got pockets of different forums. So, for example, within our planning, ministry, there's a planning forum for all of the planners in government. The CIOs have got their own forum. But how do we establish this level as part of service improvement, as part of creating agility within governments? How do we have the capability to practically share and say, well, here's a best practice, here's something that we have done as an innovation in Department X. How do we replicate this in the other departments? So I mean, it's something for us that we have to reflect on as the government, as as the public service, and how do we put in place that level of sort of interaction that we're able to openly and freely share the kind of innovations that would help. But maybe from your side, Mark, some advice that you could give us on that?
Yeah, thanks for this. Look, I think it's really about sometimes recognizing that we don't necessarily do things because we want them not to be effective, but it's by the way we were basically coming to the function in the first place. So there's many of the government function that were kind of, as I mentioned before, added on, right? They were multi strata, right, of government functions. I guess building not necessarily the private sector, but the not-for-profit, right? Take, for example, the World Economic Forum that has become renowned globally, right? But there are many. There is the Doha Forum. You're about to run an event soon, I guess, in South Africa, right? That is happening, which is kind of supposed to convene different kind of parties. So the idea is to start having more of this multiple voices representation across the same governments. To basically look at the very same question from a different perspective. And I guess this is where we do not have to delegate this directly to the good luck of a third party, of a fourth party, right? Party in terms like the organization themselves, like the forum, the working forum. It can be internalized. It can be a conversation where we having more members from interdepartmental that want to work together. I'm going to try to give an example on this. If you think about, I see this a lot when I work, I'll be closer to prime minister's level, right? So the prime minister has a cabinet of ministers, and they all know each other. They talk to each other, right? They are kind of exchanging. They sit in the same conversations, and they tend to have an understanding of the priority that the country wants to pursue. But the moment the conversation goes down at the ministry level, many of the dissonance of the information, they tend to trickle down, right? And this is clearly normal. Any degree of dissonance in the structure defines that there is less and less relevance to the original information. So you might find that how a minister thinks might be very different from how people in the middle range of the ministry operates as well. And so rethinking the degree of alignment that is interoperable across the ministries rather than only at the level of the cabinet of the ministers. And I think this is where a lot of effort needs to be done. Back to the conversation on technology as an advocacy, right? Technology helps us a lot with that. There are a lot of ways for us to at least be exposed to conversation that might be relevant to us, but because of the way they used to be performed, they never reach us in the first place. So again, these are, again, not easy solution to find or to implement, but I like to kind of, answer by saying, look, it's just by trying new things that are kind of coming from a bit of inspiration, best practices, idea, hunch, it's a calibration from practice that were not fully successful. The combination of that, they really create a fuzzy logic of success. When you do that, you are in a better way, in a better capacity of institutionalizing it moving forward than if you were trying to do it from a pure consultative perspective. And I personally find that the more we're building interdependent functions, in which we're also redistributing the accountability across departments, the better we are kind of learning the way organizations are today. And I'm talking about organization not only in terms of the public sector, but I'm talking about all of them. And I'll finish with this. Back in the days, we were extremely structured. And structure was a merit because structure was giving us a sense of control on how do you make sure that the fundamental purpose of a given function is executed. That implied that we're dealing with kind of vertical or kind of square structure, right? If you think about how a ministry was organized, it's not too different from how a company was organized. Today, most of our society operate much more as a network because we have access to information, we have reality and perception of reality, we have truth and media, and sometimes they're not necessarily the same content. We do have a much wider global audience where we're dealing with millions of people in our lifetime that maybe we never meet, but they are connecting through our capacity to use digital infrastructure. We do have instant information that are becoming kind of consumed on the spot. So it's an entirely different sense of knowledge. And it's also knowledge is much cheaper, right? It became extremely cheap to have access to knowledge. So given who we have become, we are much more network than structured. And governments have to understand that they cannot think of themselves differently from that because it's basically people, right? So once that is becoming, I think, a space, then training for public servants start taking into account that conversation. Conversation inside the ministries, they tend to take into account the interoperability we mentioned before. It's almost like an awareness step up that is going to fundamentally change the way you see your function, not because what you were doing before is bad, but because you recognize it has exhausted this function and you want to move it forward to basically with the kind of organizations we're going to build moving forward. It's an entirely different, efficient, institutional design from what we used to be.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Mark. I think it's been quite useful. Well, I think we've dealt with all of the questions that have come through, and really thank you for this engagement. I would encourage all of the participants here, if you have any follow-up questions, follow-up issues, please drop us an email. Tell us what you would like to, to hear for the future. Like I indicated at the beginning, we've got a relationship with the Mohammed bin Rashid School, and so certainly with Mark, he's going to be doing much more with us at the National School of Government. A number of webinars. We've got a series planned over the next few months. So we'd really like to invite you, share with us your thoughts, drop us an email here at the National School of Government, tell us what you would like to hear more about or, learn more about, and we'll be very happy to engage with Mark on that. Mark, I cannot thank you enough for this engagement. I think it has been extremely useful, but I'm also going to invite Bongani to officially close us off with the event today. And there's just we'll share the symposium that is coming up. But once again, thank you, and please extend our appreciation to Professor King as well at the school. Bongani, over to you.
Thank you, Dino, and thank you, Professor Mark, for this very insightful webinar that we had today. It is a beginning in a series of conversations that we are having as we march towards our T20, the Think 20 symposium that the NSG and the Institute for Global Dialogue will be hosting at UNISA as part of South Africa's G20 presidency. And this symposium actually is going to reflect on the critical capacities that public institutions would need in order to build agile institutions as we move towards the year 2030, which in South Africa we have set in the National Development Plan to eliminate poverty, unemployment, inequality. The same goes in the United Nations Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, as well as the African Union Agenda 2063. So we invite all to attend that symposium in person at UNISA. And I hope, Prof. Mark, you'll be able to join us in that virtually to give some of your insights. So thank you very much for that presentation. And thank you to the audience who have joined us today. This webinar would not have been successful and interactive without your active engagement. We'll see you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all to all of you. Bye-bye.